The first time I saw the room, my aunt was standing in front of it with a basket of folded towels in her arms, and she looked at me the way people look at a dog that has started talking. Not scared. Not even surprised exactly. Just deeply unwilling. I had been in her house maybe 20 minutes. Long enough to drag my suitcase up the narrow stairs. Long enough to notice the place still smelled like lemon polish and old paper. Long enough to remember why I hadn't been back in 9 years. She was halfway down the upstairs hall when I came out of the guest room, and there it was behind her shoulder, an extra door, where I would have sworn there had only ever been 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. I remember saying, I forgot there was a room there. And my aunt, who had known me since the day I was born, who had once driven 4 hours in a thunderstorm because I had the flu and my mother was falling apart, shifted the basket higher on her hip and said, very calmly, there isn't. Then she kept walking. That should have been the end of it. In normal families, maybe it would have been. Somebody says something strange, you laugh it off. You assume you misremembered the floor plan. You go downstairs and eat casserole under warm yellow lights and let the weird sentence dissolve into the evening. But my family had never had a normal relationship with omission. We had our own way of moving around facts. We didn't lie loudly. We pressed things flat. We stepped over them until, with enough time, everybody could agree the lump in the rug had always been part of the floor. So when she said there wasn't a room there, something old and familiar tightened inside me. Not fear, not yet. Recognition. My aunt's name is Elaine, though nobody under the age of 40 ever called her that. To us, she was just Aunt Laney, the practical one. My mother was the emotional one. My Uncle Rob was the charming one. My grandfather had been the difficult one. My grandmother the saint. Families like ours love categories because they save you the effort of looking too closely. Aunt Laney had inherited the house when my grandparents died because she was the one who had stayed. She had done the doctor's appointments and the bills and the impossible months after my grandfather's stroke. She was the one who knew where every warranty was, which faucet leaked in winter, how hard you had to hip-check the back door to get it closed in humid weather. If there was a person in the world I trusted to understand the shape of that house, it was her, which is probably why her denial unsettled me more than if she'd admitted there was a room and told me not to go in it. I stood in the hall for a while after she'd gone downstairs. The door was painted the same pale cream as the trim. It had the same old glass knob as every other upstairs door. Nothing about it looked hidden. Exactly. It wasn't tucked behind a curtain or disguised as wall paneling. It was just there, obvious and ordinary. The kind of door you would have passed 1,000 times without thinking if nobody had told you it shouldn't exist. I put my hand on the knob. Before I turned it, my aunt called from downstairs. Daniel? I jerked my hand back so fast the knob clicked against the plate. Yeah? Wash up. Dinner's ready. Her voice sounded normal. Warm, even. But I stared at the door another second before going down, and I had the disorienting feeling that I'd almost done something rude in church without understanding why. The reason I was staying there at all was simple enough. My apartment lease had ended 2 weeks before my new job started in another city, and Aunt Laney had offered her guest room without hesitation. Save your money, she'd said. It'll be nice to have someone in the house. My mother had been thrilled in that strained way she gets when something allows her to pretend our family is more cohesive than it is. She told me I should take Aunt Laney flowers when I arrived. She told me not to mention the house being sold, because that subject upset her. She told me not to bring up Grandpa, because that upset everyone. She told me not to leave dishes in the sink, because Aunt Laney was too polite to complain but definitely minded. She did not tell me there was a room no one admitted existed. At dinner, it was just the 2 of us at the table under the old brass chandelier. The house looked almost exactly the way it had when I was a kid. Same dark wood hutch, same braided rug under the table, same bowl of fake pears on the counter. Dusty, in a way that suggested permanence rather than neglect. The only major difference was the absence of my grandparents. A space can change shape around a missing person. Their absence had a texture. It sat in the rooms. Aunt Lainey served chicken pot pie onto our plates and asked about the drive. I answered. She asked about my new job. I told her the truth. Mostly that I was excited, that I was nervous, that I still wasn't sure. Moving into project management after 3 years of drifting between temp work and freelance design meant I had my life together so much as I had become good at sounding like I did. She smiled at the appropriate places. She told me her neighbor Ruth's maple tree had finally come down in the spring storm. She told me the grocery store on Maple Avenue had closed and become a pharmacy. She told me the church had replaced the carpeting in the fellowship hall and everybody hated it. It was all so normal that eventually I started to wonder if I had imagined the moment upstairs, or exaggerated it in my head because I was tired. But the more ordinary the conversation stayed, the more deliberate that ordinariness began to feel. Finally, I said, "Did you renovate upstairs?" Her spoon paused halfway to her mouth. Just for a second. "No. I thought I saw..." I tried to keep my tone light. "I don't know. Another door in the hallway. I think I'm remembering the layout wrong." "You probably are." She took the bite. I waited. That was it. No explanation. No laugh. "No. That's always been the linen closet." "No. Your grandfather put in a little storage room after you stopped visiting." Just, "You probably are." For some reason that made me feel younger than being back in that house already had. There's a specific humiliation in sensing that an older relative has decided what is and isn't discussable, and that you've somehow crossed the line without being told where it is. So I dropped it. After dinner I offered to help clean up, and she let me dry dishes while she washed. The kitchen window was open over the sink, letting in the smell of cut grass and the distant whine of somebody's power tools. We fell into the rhythm of passing plates and glasses between us. It should have been comforting. It almost was. Then, while I was putting away the serving spoon, I said, "Do you ever think about selling this place?" The second the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Not because of my mother's warning, because Aunt Lainey's shoulders changed. Very slightly, but enough. "No," she said. "Sorry," Mom mentioned. "Your mother mentions a lot of things." Her tone wasn't sharp, exactly. More closed, like a drawer being pushed in. I nodded. Fair. We finished the dishes in silence. A little later she went to watch television in the den, and I took a beer out onto the back porch. The yard looked smaller than I remembered, but that's the kind of thing people always say when they go back to childhood places, as if memory uses a wider lens. Fireflies blinked over the grass. Somebody's dog barked 2 houses over. I could see the upstairs windows reflecting the bruised blue of dusk. I told myself not to be stupid. A weird door. A defensive answer. An old family house, full of old family habits. That was all. But when I went up to bed, I found myself slowing at the top of the stairs before I even meant to. The hallway was dim, except for the bathroom nightlight, that same cheap shell-shaped one my grandmother had used since the 90s. The extra door was there. Of course it was. Cream paint. Glass knob. Closed. The guest room was on one side of the hall, the bathroom at the end, Aunt Lainey's room on the other side. The extra door sat between the bathroom and the guest room. It looked perfectly integrated, as if it had always been part of the house. And yet when I tried to picture the hallway from childhood, my memory slid around it like a tire on ice. I stood there listening. The house had its old sounds. Settling wood, the low tick of pipes, the refrigerator cycling somewhere downstairs. Nothing from behind the door. I reached out again, slower this time, and turned the knob. It wouldn't move. Locked. That alone shouldn't have mattered. Plenty of interior doors lock. But my pulse kicked hard enough that I actually laughed under my breath, irritated with myself. I was 31 years old. I was not in a Gothic novel. I was staying in my aunt's spare room for a month, not uncovering some family curse. Still, when I got into bed, I left the lamp on for a while longer than usual. The next morning I woke up, disoriented by sunlight, through unfamiliar curtains. For a few seconds I couldn't place where I was, which decade, What version of myself? Then the room came back into focus. Floral wallpaper, oak dresser, a framed watercolor of ducks over the bed. My grandmother's guest room, preserved by my aunt with all the stubbornness of someone who believes continuity can fend off grief. I got dressed and opened the bedroom door. The hall outside looked normal. Too normal. I mean the sort of normality that feels arranged. Like a photograph straightened on the wall right after an argument. The extra door was still there, and on the floor in front of it sat a narrow table I was almost sure had not been there the night before, with a ceramic lamp and a stack of mail neatly placed on top. I stared at it for a long moment. It was a small hallway table, the sort of thing you'd barely notice anywhere else. But this hall had not had room for one. I knew that. The table narrowed the space in a way that made the whole layout make less sense. It looked as if someone had placed furniture not to decorate, but to occupy the exact patch of floor where a person might naturally stand if they wanted to open the door. When I went downstairs, Aunt Lainey was at the stove, making oatmeal. "Morning," she said. "Morning." I poured coffee. "Did you move a table upstairs?" "Yes." The answer came too fast. "Why?" "It was in the attic. I thought it looked nice there." I leaned against the counter. There wasn't room there before. "There's room now." She said it with her back to me, stirring the pot. I watched her for a second. "Okay." At breakfast, she asked if I could help her move a few boxes from the basement later. I said sure. The request felt strategic, though I couldn't have said why. Maybe because it was unlike her to need help, and even less like her to ask for it casually. Maybe because the timing suggested she wanted me occupied in ways that didn't involve upstairs hallways. Afterward, I called my mother from the backyard under the pretense of checking in. "Did Aunt Lainey ever change the upstairs?" I asked once we'd gotten through the usual script. "What do you mean, change it? Like add a room or something?" There was a pause. "No. She says I'm remembering it wrong." Another pause. Longer. Then my mother laughed, but it sounded misplaced, like she'd reached for the wrong coat. "You probably are. You were little." "I wasn't that little." "You haven't been there in years, Danny." There are tones parents use that don't age with you. They can still flatten you at 31 if they match an old shape in your nervous system. My mother's had just landed squarely on. "Stop poking." I said, "Did Grandma ever use that room?" "What room?" "The one upstairs." Silence. Then, "How's Lainey doing?" I actually pulled the phone away and looked at it, as if I could see her dodging through the speaker. "Mom, she's been alone in that house a long time." "Mom, I worry about her." You just skipped right over what I asked. "I don't know what you want me to say." The irritation in her voice was real now, and underneath it something else. Not anger, alarm, maybe, but of a very domestic kind. Not, "Don't go into the basement. There's a monster." More like, "Please do not pry open the thing this family has balanced dinner plates on for 20 years. I felt suddenly ashamed, though I still didn't know why. "Never mind," I said. "Don't upset her." That got me. I'm not trying to upset her. I know. I'm just saying. Be gentle. We ended the call on strained but polite terms. I stood in the yard holding the dead phone and felt that strange old childhood sensation again. The sense that the adults around me were all reading from a script I had somehow missed. The basement boxes turned out to be Christmas decorations and old linens. Aunt Lainey directed the process with brisk efficiency. She wore rubber-soled gardening shoes and had tied a dish towel around her waist for some reason, like she was about to paint or butcher a chicken. The basement smelled of cardboard and cool concrete. Nothing in it was remotely sinister. That almost made things worse. The normality of the rest of the house made the silence around the room feel more deliberate. By noon we were done. She made tomato sandwiches for lunch. In the afternoon I drove into town for groceries she claimed she didn't need, but wrote a list for anyway. I spent longer than necessary in the store, wandering aisles and telling myself I was not being manipulated by a 70-year-old woman with excellent casserole dishes. When I got back, her car was gone. I checked the clock over the stove. 3:15. On the table was a note in her compact, careful handwriting. Went to Ruth's. Back before supper. There's iced tea in the fridge. That was it. No, don't go upstairs. No mention of when exactly she'd left. No sign that the note was anything but ordinary. I stood in the kitchen holding the grocery bag handles so tightly the plastic cut my fingers. Then I put the groceries away one by one, because apparently some part of me wanted to prove I was still a civilized person. Then I went upstairs. The hallway was bright with afternoon light from the bathroom window. The table was still in front of the door, with the lamp and stack of mail. I moved them first, very carefully, placing them on the floor. Then I lifted the table. It was lighter than I expected, which made me think it had been put there quickly. The door stood bare in front of me. I turned the knob. Locked. I crouched and examined the lock. Old-fashioned interior mechanism, not fancy. The kind you could probably open with a pin or a small screwdriver if you had patience and didn't mind feeling like a criminal. I actually laughed, just once, because the situation had become ridiculous. I was a grown man considering picking a lock in my aunt's hallway, because everyone in my family was suddenly pretending architecture was subjective. I went to the guest room, took 2 bobby pins from my toiletry bag left over from a Halloween costume years ago that I still used for random practical purposes, and came back. It took less than a minute. I wish I could say there was a dramatic swell of dread as the lock clicked, some primal warning, some instinct screaming at me to stop. There wasn't. What I felt instead was a deep, almost embarrassing curiosity tinged with triumph, like I had solved a petty mystery. I opened the door. The room beyond was small, smaller than I expected, not secret passage small, not impossible geometry small, just an ordinary room that made the upstairs make sense in a way my memory had somehow avoided. A square space with one narrow window looking over the side yard, hardwood floors, faded wallpaper, with tiny blue flowers, a twin bed against one wall, covered in a plain white quilt, a dresser, a chair, a bookshelf, with almost no books on it. Sunlight lay across the floorboards in a long gold rectangle, and the first thing I thought was not why did they hide this from me? It was, I know this room, not as a memory, as a feeling, the exact way a song can hit you before you know where you've heard it. I stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Not stale. Exactly. The room had been kept, not abandoned. The bed was made with hospital corners. The dresser top had been wiped recently enough that the light caught no dust on the surface. On the chair sat a folded cardigan, pale gray, as if somebody had just taken it off. I closed the door behind me without thinking, and the latch clicked loud enough to make me flinch. There were only 3 books on the shelf: a Bible, a collection of bird illustrations, a paperback novel with the spine broken in the middle. I looked at the dresser next. Hairbrush, small porcelain dish, a pair of reading glasses. Nothing strange, nothing occult, no locked trunk, no blood-stained wallpaper, no child's drawings. On the wall above the bed hung a framed photograph. I stepped closer. It showed my grandmother sitting in that very room, in that very chair, wearing the gray cardigan. The window behind her was open. Her hands were folded in her lap. She looked older than I had ever really let myself register her becoming. Smaller in the face, with that papery quality people get late in life when the bones begin to show their architecture. But she was smiling. I stared at it until a cold prickling started at the back of my neck, because I had never seen this photograph before, and because, in my family, there are no photographs in unknown rooms. Every photo in that house had been displayed 100 times, discussed to death, incorporated into the family mythology. My first communion, my mother's wedding, Uncle Rob in a varsity jacket, Grandpa, holding a fish. Grandma, in the kitchen at Thanksgiving. The visual evidence of who we had been was not hidden. It was curated. So why was there a picture of my grandmother in a room no one would acknowledge? I looked at the nightstand. A glass of water sat there with a crocheted coaster underneath, the kind my grandmother used to make while watching television. Beside it was a box of tissues and a small brass clock, unplugged. Everything in the room suggested use, but not current use. The preserved stillness of a place, maintained for the sake of an ending that had already happened. Then I opened the top dresser drawer. Inside were neatly folded nightgowns. The second drawer held slips and stockings. The third held adult diapers. I stood there with the drawer half open, my triumph evaporating so completely it felt childish. Because now I understood one thing, if not all of it. This had not been a mysterious room. This had been a sick room, and I had just broken into it like an idiot. I closed the drawer carefully and sat down on the chair because my knees had gone weak with shame. The house was silent around me. From outside came the distant metallic bark of somebody hammering something in a yard. A lawnmower started 2 streets over. The world remained brutally ordinary. I looked again at the photograph of my grandmother smiling in the chair, and a memory surfaced, not visual, not complete, just the sensation of being 10 years old and brought to this house for a weekend when my grandfather was having one of his spells, and being told very firmly not to go upstairs because Grandma was resting. I remembered cartoons in the den, the smell of Vicks, my mother crying quietly in the kitchen while Aunt Lainey said, "Not where he can hear you." I remembered being taken home early, but I did not remember this room. Or maybe I did, and had been trained out of it. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard the front door downstairs open and close. My whole body went hot with panic. I stood up too fast, hit the bed frame with my shin, and had to bite back a curse. Then I looked around, absurdly, as if there might be somewhere to hide. Of course there wasn't. It was a small, square room with 1 door and 1 window overlooking the driveway. I could already hear my aunt moving around below, setting something on the kitchen counter. I considered leaving the way I came and pretending nothing had happened. But the table was still moved. The mail and lamp were on the floor. There was no version of this where she wouldn't know. So I opened the door and stepped into the hallway just as she reached the bottom of the stairs and looked up. We stared at each other. She took in the moved table, the items on the floor, the open door behind me. Her face didn't harden. That would have been easier. What happened instead was a kind of collapse, so contained it was almost dignified. She closed her eyes once, briefly, and when she opened them again she looked older than she had that morning. "I thought," she said, "that maybe if nobody said anything, you'd leave it alone." I opened my mouth, but I had no defense that didn't sound exactly as childish as it was. "I'm sorry." She stood there a moment longer, then nodded toward the room behind me. "Put the table back where it was." I did. She waited until the lamp and mail were restored too, not saying a word. Then she turned and went downstairs. I followed her to the kitchen, my chest tight. She was taking a pie from the refrigerator, not because she wanted pie, I realized, but because her hands needed something procedural to do. She set it on the counter and adjusted the plastic wrap pointlessly at the edges. "I didn't know," I said. "No," she said. "You didn't." Another silence. I thought maybe it was... I stopped. "What?" "I don't know. Something hidden." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "It was hidden." "I didn't mean... I know what you meant." She pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table. After a moment, she gestured to the chair across from her. I sat. The late afternoon light made rectangles on the floor. The refrigerator hummed. My aunt folded her hands on the table, those same capable hands that had tied my shoes when I was little, and wrapped my grandfather's pills in a weekly organizer after his stroke, and carried 1,000 casseroles to 1,000 funerals. "That room," she said, "is where your grandmother lived for the last 8 months of her life. I didn't speak. She had falls, confusion. Then she got worse all at once. Aunt Lainey looked past me toward the sink. Your grandfather could not manage it. He wouldn't admit that, but he couldn't. So we moved her upstairs, because it was easier to keep things set up in one place. Hospital bed at first. Then when she was stronger for a while, we put the old twin frame back in because she hated feeling like an invalid. A tiny pause. She died in that room in February, during the ice storm. I swallowed. I didn't know. No. Her mouth tightened. We made sure you didn't. Why? That seemed to irritate her, though not at me specifically, more at the shape of the question itself. Because you were young. I was 22. You were young for losing people properly. I thought about arguing that there is no age at which families should decide grief on your behalf, but something in her expression stopped me. Instead, I said, why pretend the room doesn't exist now? She looked at me then, really looked. Her eyes were not watery. She wasn't on the edge of some cathartic confession. If anything, she seemed annoyed that language was required at all. Because your mother can't bear it, she said. Because your uncle never came while she was sick and prefers not to remember that. Because after your grandfather died, every conversation about that room became a fight about what should have happened, who should have helped, whether I should have put her in a facility, whether your grandfather knew how bad things were, whether we failed them both. She leaned back in the chair. Because in this family, if a place contains too much of what actually happened, people start talking as though the place itself is the problem. I sat very still. She asked us not to call it the sick room, Aunt Lainey went on after a moment. Your grandmother did. Said if we named it that, she'd never feel like herself in there. So most of the time we just said, I'm taking this upstairs. Or, she's resting. Or, did you check on her? Her fingers moved once against the tabletop. After she was gone, nobody knew what to call it. So they didn't. The answer was so painfully human it made everything stranger, not less. But Mom acted like, your mother has a talent for agreeing to silence and then pretending the silence was naturally occurring. That startled a laugh out of me despite everything. Aunt Lainey's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. I'm sorry, I said again, more honestly this time. I know. She got up and went back to the refrigerator, then stopped with her hand on the door. You weren't supposed to know because there isn't anything useful in knowing, only sadness, and some anger that has nowhere to go. I watched her shoulders. Then why keep it? That made her turn. What do you mean? The room. Why keep it like that? For the first time, uncertainty crossed her face. Not defensiveness, something more exposed. I don't know, she said. That should have settled it. It probably would have in a healthier family. Mystery solved. Room identified. Grief acknowledged badly, but acknowledged. I could have apologized, helped eat the pie, and gone on with my month. But once truth enters a system built on omission, it rarely stops at the first door. That night I dreamed about my grandmother, though the dream itself vanished on waking. All that remained was the emotional residue, an ache mixed with embarrassment, like having shown up late to something important. I lay in bed, listening to the house, and thought about the room. Not with the same curiosity as before. Now what gnawed at me was the odd mismatch between my aunt's explanation and the atmosphere surrounding it. Families hide illness. Families avoid the rooms where people suffered. That part I understood. What I didn't understand was the choreography, the moved table, the immediate denial, the way my mother had reacted as if I'd touched a live wire. The problem no longer felt like the room itself. It felt like the effort required to maintain the fiction around it. The next day, I avoided the subject completely. So did Aunt Lainey. We spent the morning weeding the side flower beds. She showed me how the peonies needed staking because the blooms got too heavy after rain. At lunch, she made egg salad. In the afternoon, I drove to the hardware store with a list of things she needed. It was almost peaceful. At one point, While sorting screws on the back porch, she said, "Thank you for not calling your mother." I glanced up. I wasn't planning to. Good. It was such a blunt answer that I couldn't help smiling. "You know that makes me want to more." She snorted. "No, it doesn't. You hate being triangulated." She knew me too well. I went back to the screws. By evening, I had almost convinced myself to let the matter rest. Not because I was satisfied, but because it had clearly become one of those family zones where understanding would cost more than it paid. Then, while looking for a flashlight in the hall closet upstairs after dark, I found something shoved behind a stack of extra blankets. A child's drawing. Crayon on printer paper, folded twice and yellowed at the creases. A house with a smoking chimney. A stick figure woman in a blue dress. A sun in the corner. And on the second floor of the house, 3 square windows and 1 smaller window drawn off to the side, with a little red rectangle beside it that was clearly meant to be a door. Across the top, in blocky green letters, was written, "Grandma's New Room." There was no name on it, but I knew instantly it was mine. Not because I remembered drawing it, because I recognized the desperate confidence of a child trying to make sense of something adults had failed to explain. I stood there in the hallway with the paper in my hand and felt, more than thought, they had erased me from this too. Not maliciously, maybe not even consciously, but completely. I took the drawing downstairs. Aunt Lainey was reading in the den with her glasses low on her nose. When she saw what I was holding, all the color drained from her face. "Where did you get that?" "Hall closet." She set the book down very carefully. "I thought I'd thrown that away." "Well, you didn't." I don't know what expression I had, but after a moment she sighed and took off her glasses. "You used to come every Sunday with your mother," she said. I sat opposite her, the drawing spread on my knee. "When Grandma got worse?" "Before, during, after. Time blurs." She rubbed the bridge of her nose. "At first, she was downstairs, still. Then, after she fell again, we moved her up because the downstairs bath wasn't safe, and she didn't want equipment in the living room where everyone could see it. You asked why she had moved into the little room. Someone told you she liked the window." A pause. "You started drawing her in it, all the time, bringing her pictures to tape up by the bed." I stared at the paper. I had no memory of this. None. Not even a blurred impression. How do I not remember that? Because your mother stopped bringing you after a while. That landed between us heavily. Why? Aunt Lainey looked back at her abandoned book instead of at me. Because you asked too many direct questions. Because one Sunday you came home and told her Grandma had forgotten your name for a minute, and she cried in the bathroom for an hour, because it became easier to say you had homework. I looked down at my childhood drawing of a room no one admitted existed, and felt anger rise so cleanly it surprised me. Not theatrical anger, nothing hot, just a narrowing, a sense of something aligning. My mother erased that whole period. Aunt Lainey's silence was confirmation enough. And everyone went along with it? Not everyone. Close enough. She winced, just slightly. I regretted it at once. Not because it wasn't true, but because she had been the one doing the hard thing while everyone else fled or edited. Still, the anger stayed. That night I did call my mother. She answered on the 3rd ring, already sounding wary. "Hi, honey. I found a drawing I made," I said, "of Grandma's room." Silence. Then, softly, "Oh." That one syllable contained so much defeat that my rehearsed confrontation faltered. "You knew I remembered it," I said. "No," she said quickly. "No, Danny. I knew you used to know about it. I didn't know what you remembered now." "Why didn't you tell me?" My mother exhaled shakily. "Because what would have been the point?" There it is again. What? That line. As if information has to justify itself morally before anybody's allowed to have it. She didn't answer. I stood by the dark kitchen window while moths battered themselves against the porch light. Why was it so important to act like it never happened? My mother's voice, when it came, was tired in a way I wasn't used to hearing, because I could not fix any of it. That doesn't answer the question. Yes, it does. A pause. You think silence is the same as deception, because you're still young enough to imagine people hide things strategically. Sometimes they hide things because they can't carry them in the open. I leaned against the counter, suddenly exhausted. So, you just decided I didn't need the truth. I decided you didn't need the worst images of the people you loved. The unfairness of that lodged in me. I'm not talking about some terrible image. I'm talking about a room in a house. No. Her voice sharpened. You're talking about your grandmother calling me Helen because she thought I was her sister. You're talking about your grandfather sobbing in the garage where she couldn't hear him. You're talking about your aunt sleeping in a chair for months because nobody else stayed long enough to spell her. You're talking about me driving home and trying to make dinner for you after spending all day pretending my mother was still my mother. She stopped. When she spoke again, her voice had gone quiet. That room was not just a room. I had no answer to that. After a while, I said, "Why didn't anyone tell me later? I thought maybe you'd been spared." Spared what? Memory? Maybe. That was so honest and so hopeless that it took the air out of me. We talked for another half hour. Not neatly. Not with any grand reconciliation. My mother admitted she had started avoiding the house before my grandmother even died, because she couldn't bear the feeling that every visit required performing a version of optimism she no longer believed in. She admitted she resented Aunt Laney for being better at the logistics of care, then hated herself for resenting her. She admitted that after the funerals, whenever the upstairs came up, everyone became so brittle and accusing that it felt simpler to speak around it. And then years pass, she said, and whatever you fail to name starts feeling like something that cannot be named. When I hung up, I didn't feel satisfied, but I did feel the scale of the thing more clearly. The room wasn't haunting the family because of what had happened in it. It was haunting the family because it had become the container for all the parts of that time nobody could discuss without indicting themselves or each other. I should have let it go then. Instead, over the next week, I found myself drawn not to the room itself, but to the evidence of how everyone had arranged themselves around it. It changed the house. Once I knew where to look, I saw the edits everywhere. Old photo albums with that window always cropped out. Stories about my grandmother's final winter that somehow took place entirely downstairs. A set of caregiving invoices filed in a drawer labeled Guest Bath Remodel, though they clearly referred to upstairs equipment. The little lies weren't malicious. They were adhesive. The family had used them to hold shape. Aunt Laney didn't stop me from noticing. She just watched with a kind of grim patience, as if she had known this would happen once the first thread came loose. One afternoon, while dusting the dining room hutch, I asked, "Did Grandpa go in there much?" She was polishing silver at the table. Less near the end. Because it upset him? Because she didn't always know him, and he couldn't bear being the stranger. That answer stayed with me. Later that evening, I stood in the upstairs hall, staring at the table in front of the door. The barrier no longer seemed defensive. It seemed ceremonial. Not keep out so much as remember how we managed. I moved it aside again. This time, I knocked before entering. It felt silly, but also right. Inside, the room had changed, only because I had changed. Once, it had been a mystery. Then, a shameful revelation. Now, it felt like the most honest room in the house. Not because it contained some hidden truth, but because everything in it was exactly what it was. I sat in the chair beneath my grandmother's photograph and looked around more carefully. The wallpaper had been patched near the baseboard by the window. A water stain marked one corner of the ceiling. The bird book on the shelf had slips of paper marking pages on chickadees, cardinals, and cedar waxwings. The cardigan on the chair smelled faintly, impossibly, of the rose soap my grandmother used to buy in bulk. Or maybe I imagined that because I wanted some sensory bridge. Memory is opportunistic. In the bottom dresser drawer, beneath folded blankets, I found a stack of notebooks. For a second, I thought they might be journals, and a pulse of invasive excitement went through me. Then I saw the dates on the covers and understood. Medication logs, symptom notes, appointment summaries. Pages and pages in my aunt's handwriting documenting blood pressure, appetite, confusion episodes, sleep, the record of care, meticulous and almost unbearably plain. Tucked into the last notebook was a loose sheet written in a shakier hand. Not my aunt's, my grandmother's. It wasn't a letter. It was a list. Things I do not want them to forget. That was the heading. Below it, in unsteady but legible script, the red bowl in the pantry is from our honeymoon. Rob hated peas and would hide them in the radiator cover. Helen always sang the wrong words and louder if corrected. Danny liked the blue room because of rain on the gutter. Lainey bites the inside of her cheek when she is angry and thinks nobody notices. I stopped there. My throat had closed. There were 20 or 30 items, some domestic, some trivial, some devastating in their specificity. The kind of details that vanish first when somebody becomes declining or difficult, or not herself. It was less a list of facts than a refusal to be reduced. At the bottom, in lines that slanted badly downward, she had written, "If I am in the little room, it is still my house." I sat there a long time with the page in my hands. When I finally took it downstairs, Aunt Lainey did not ask where I found it. She looked at the paper, sat down hard at the kitchen table, and covered her mouth with one hand. "I forgot about that," she said. "Did she write it there?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" She laughed once through her nose, not happily. "Who was I supposed to tell? Your mother would have cried. Your uncle would have called it heartbreaking and gone home. Your grandfather would have acted offended that anyone thought he might forget the red bowl." She looked up at me. "Some things become private because there's nobody around who can hold them properly." I thought about that for a while. Then I said, "Maybe that's the whole problem." She didn't answer. The idea came to me 2 days later while we were sorting old Tupperware lids in the kitchen, which is proof that important decisions are almost never made during appropriately cinematic moments. "What if we stop pretending?" I said. Aunt Lainey, elbow deep in plastic containers, didn't look up. "About what?" "The room. We're not pretending anymore. You know about it. I mean with everyone." That got her attention. "No." "Why not?" "Because I am 70 years old and tired." "I know. But listen." "No, Daniel." She said my full name, the way she did when she wanted me to understand this. Was not a conversational volley, but I had the list in my mind, and the photograph, and my own crayon drawing, and the years of edited family history stretching behind us like patched fabric. You can't keep carrying the whole truth alone just because everyone else is bad at it. "That is a lovely sentence," she said. "Unfortunately, I live with actual people." I almost laughed, but didn't. "Then actual people can come over and sit in the actual room for 10 minutes. Her face changed. Not much, but enough for me to know I'd finally touched the real objection. "They won't," she said. Not angry, not defensive, certain. And beneath the certainty, hurt so old it had set like plaster. That was the moment I understood the room was not only about grief or memory, it was also about witness. My aunt had done the ugliest, longest, least glamorous part of loving her parents. And afterward, the family had allowed that reality to become unspeakable, because speaking it would have meant facing what they had not done. The room was evidence, not of abuse, not of horror in the lurid sense, of devotion, exhaustion, resentment, tenderness, failure, of the whole tangled human mess. Easier, then, to let it become non-existent. A week later, Uncle Rob came by. He lived only 40 minutes away, but had somehow managed to visit exactly once while I was there. He swept into the kitchen in loafers and a half-zipped windbreaker, smelling faintly of expensive aftershave and car leather. At 65, he still had the kind of handsome face that made older women at church call him a charmer. in tones that forgave a lot. He hugged me, kissed Aunt Laney's cheek, and immediately began talking about traffic and golf. For 20 minutes, we performed family, coffee, cookies from the freezer, questions about my job, comments on the weather. Then, while Aunt Laney was in the pantry, I said, "Do you remember Grandma's room upstairs?" He went still, only for a second, but it was unmistakable. Then he took a sip of coffee. "What about it?" So there it was. Not denial, not with him, just a quick calculation. "I found some things from that time," I said. "A drawing I made, a list she wrote." Uncle Rob put the cup down. "Laney told you?" "No, I found it." The pantry door opened, and Aunt Laney came out holding a bag of flour. She looked from me to him and understood at once. "Don't start," she said. "I'm not starting anything," I said. "You are always starting things in a mild voice," she said. Uncle Rob actually smiled at that, despite the tension. Then I said, "Why did you all act like it never existed?" He looked at his sister. "Seriously?" She asked the question, Aunt Laney said. "I'm not answering for you." He rubbed his jaw. "Because it was awful. That's not a reason. It is if you're the one who keeps replaying it." I leaned forward. "But you never came." The silence after that was so total I could hear the refrigerator motor kick on again. I had not planned to say it. The words simply arrived, clean and sharp. Uncle Rob stared at me. To his credit, he didn't deflect. "No," he said. "I didn't." Aunt Laney set the flour down very gently on the counter. He looked at his hands. I told myself I was helping by staying out of the way. Then I told myself hospitals and sick rooms made me useless. Then I told myself there was no point making a spectacle when Laney had it handled. He shrugged, once, almost helplessly. "By the time I understood those were all the same excuse, your grandmother was dead." No one spoke. It was one of the few times in my life I had ever heard an adult relative tell the truth without decorating it. Uncle Rob stood and walked to the sink, looking out into the yard. Afterward, every time I came here, I could feel that room upstairs like a hand on the back of my neck, he said. "Not because of ghosts, because of arithmetic. Hours I hadn't spent, calls I hadn't made, nights I didn't sit up with either of them. So yes, it was easier not to mention it." Aunt Laney's face had gone completely unreadable. He turned back. "That doesn't make it fair." "No," she said. "It doesn't. I don't know what I expected then. An apology, maybe. A fight. Tears. Some dramatic family combustion. But real reckonings are often quieter than that." Uncle Rob sat back down. My aunt made more coffee. Nobody raised their voice. The truths, when they finally came in ordinary tones. By the end of the afternoon, the story had widened. My mother had stopped bringing me not only because I asked questions, but because she couldn't bear seeing the burden settle visibly onto Aunt Laney without knowing how to share it. My grandfather had refused outside care until the very end, because he thought allowing strangers into the house would dishonor my grandmother's wish to remain home. Though what he really feared was becoming irrelevant in his own marriage. Aunt Laney had kept the room intact partly out of loyalty, partly out of inertia, and partly because dismantling it felt too much like letting everyone else have the last edit. Nothing supernatural happened in that house. No hidden figure in the doorway, no voice in the walls, no impossible architecture, and yet the room had altered all of us. It had become the place where reality waited when everybody downstairs was busy maintaining their preferred versions of themselves. 3 days after Uncle Rob's visit, my mother came over. She arrived carrying a pie she had clearly bought rather than made, which in our family counts as an emotional white flag. Her eyes were pink around the edges before she even took off her shoes. "I hate that you ambushed your uncle," she told me in the kitchen. "I didn't ambush him." "You absolutely did." Then she hugged me so hard my shoulder cracked, and I knew she was more frightened than angry. The three of us sat at the table for nearly an hour before anyone mentioned the room. We talked about nonsense first. traffic, my cousin's divorce, the state of the church roof, the pie. Then my mother set down her fork and said, very quietly, I have not been upstairs in 11 years. Aunt Lainey, across from her, said, I know. I thought if I did, I'd have to admit I left you alone with it. You did leave me alone with it. I almost interfered. The sentence sounded cruel, but my aunt's tone was not cruel. It was precise. My mother closed her eyes. I know. That was the beginning. Not forgiveness. Not absolution. Just a beginning. They went upstairs together. I stayed in the kitchen because it was not my moment to witness. For a long time I heard nothing. Then, floorboards. Then, faintly, my mother crying in a way I had heard only a few times in my life, quiet enough to sound embarrassed by itself. When they came down, my mother looked washed out but steadier. She kept the glasses, she said to me, as if continuing a conversation. Your grandmother's reading glasses. I thought those were gone. Aunt Lainey said, No. My mother nodded and sat down again. The room is smaller than I remembered. I smiled despite everything. I said the same thing about the yard. For the first time that day, she laughed. What changed after that was not dramatic, but it was real. My mother began referring to the room directly. Not every time, not perfectly, but enough. Uncle Rob came by the following Sunday and went upstairs alone for 10 minutes before leaving with red eyes and a strangely relaxed face, as though a low-grade fever had finally broken. Aunt Lainey started telling stories from that winter without sanding all the edges off. Ugly stories sometimes. Tender ones, too. My grandmother throwing a spoon because someone brought her oatmeal again. My grandfather reading aloud from the newspaper after she stopped following the plot, but still liked the sound of his voice. The cardinal that landed on the sill so often, she started expecting it before breakfast. As for me, I spent more time in the room than anyone probably expected. Not obsessively. I didn't turn it into a shrine or a personal project. I just sat there sometimes. Read the bird book. Looked through the notebooks. Let the place become specific instead of symbolic. The more specific it became, the less power it had as a family myth. It was only ever dangerous when it remained vague. On my last week in the house, Aunt Lainey stood in the doorway while I was making the bed in there. We should probably change this room, she said. I looked up. Do you want to? She considered. I want not to have to guard it anymore. That seemed like the truest possible answer. So over the next few days we changed it. Slowly. Not erased. Changed. We packed away the nightgowns and medical notebooks in labeled boxes. We kept the photograph, kept the chair, kept the bird book, and the little brass clock. My mother came over and took the gray cardigan, pressing it to her face before folding it into her bag. Uncle Rob took the red bowl from the pantry and admitted he had completely forgotten it was from their honeymoon. That sent us all into such unexpectedly genuine laughter that Aunt Lainey had to sit down. We painted the walls a warm plain white. We took down the faded blue flower wallpaper in strips. Underneath one section, in pencil, was a crooked line marking somebody's height from decades ago. Then another, names and dates, mine among them, age 8. The little room had been many rooms before any of us decided what it meant. That discovery affected me more than I expected. There, beneath the wallpaper of the sick room, under the years of silence and care and omission, was evidence of ordinary growth. Children measured against a wall, time recorded in inches, the house refusing, in its own quiet way, to let any single sorrow be the only story. On my last night before moving to the new city, I couldn't sleep. I got up around 1 and walked the house in darkness, not turning on lights. The familiar unfamiliarity of it had settled into something gentler over the month. I stood in the upstairs hall outside the room, no table there now, and listened to the house breathe around me. Then I opened the door and went in. Moonlight silvered the floorboards. The bed was neatly made with a new quilt Aunt Lainey had found in the cedar chest. On the dresser sat the reading glasses, the brass clock, and the framed photograph of my grandmother smiling in the chair. The room no longer looked like a place held in suspension. It looked inhabitable. Still, I sat in the chair and thought about all the versions of the room that had existed in one space. A child's measured wall, a place for convalescence, a place for dying, a place for avoidance, a place for blame, a place for memory. Maybe now, just a room again. I took out my phone and, after hesitating only a second, opened the Notes app. I typed, things I do not want them to forget. The red bowl, the cardinal at the window, the rain gutter outside the blue room. That silence is not the same as peace. That Aunt Lainey carried more than anyone said aloud. That my mother came back upstairs. That Uncle Rob told the truth in the kitchen. That Grandma asked not to be reduced to the little room. That the little room was still part of the house. Then I added one more line. That pretending something does not exist only teaches it to wait. I didn't leave the note there. I'm not that sentimental. I emailed it to myself and sat for a while longer in the moonlight, listening to the old house settle. In the morning, Aunt Lainey hugged me at the front door and told me to call when I got to the new apartment. Then she adjusted my collar like I was 17 and said, "And do not turn this into one of your meaningful silences. If you're upset with your mother about all this, be upset directly. I know. I'm serious. I know." She nodded, satisfied. As I carried the last box to the car, I looked up at the second-floor windows. The little room's window caught the morning sun. From the driveway, it no longer looked hidden. I'm not sure it ever really had. It had only been unspoken. And unspoken things can dominate a family more thoroughly than secrets, because nobody ever has to admit they are keeping them. A month later, after I had moved and the new job had begun, and my life was filling with spreadsheets and takeout containers, and the minor bureaucratic humiliations of adulthood, my mother called me on a Tuesday night. "I was at Laney's," she said without preamble. "Okay." We sat in that room and had tea. I smiled into the phone. "That's nice." "Yes," she said, and I could hear the wonder in it. It was. Then, after a pause, I told her I was sorry. I leaned back on my couch. Outside my apartment window, city traffic hissed along wet streets. What did she say? She said, "I know. Drink your tea before it gets cold." I laughed. My mother laughed too, shaky and relieved. We talked a little longer, about nothing much. Before hanging up, she said, "You know, I really thought not naming it would make it smaller." I know. It didn't. No? After the call, I sat in the dark for a while, thinking about houses and families and the odd things we do to avoid being seen at our most helpless. I thought about how often love becomes administrative near the end, medication charts and washed sheets and half-eaten toast, and how badly people want to look away from that because it threatens every prettier story. They've told about devotion. I thought about my grandmother writing her list in a shaking hand so that being diminished would not become being forgotten. Mostly, though, I thought about the room itself, not haunted, not cursed, just burdened by everyone's refusal to let it be fully real. That was the strangest part, in the end. The room had never asked for anything supernatural from us. It only required witness. And for years, that had been more than any of us wanted to give. Sometimes I still dream about the house. In the dream, I'm standing in the upstairs hall, but I'm every age I've ever been there at once, 8 and 22 and 31. The hall is dim, the bathroom night light glowing softly, and the little room's door is closed at the end. I know, in the dream, that I can open it whenever I want. I also know that what matters is not whether the room contains something frightening. What matters is whether I can bear to say, simply, and without flinching, "There it is."